Hey guys, Coach Logan here again, this time with part 2 of my series on how to play against e4. In the last video we talked about playing against the 4 knights. In this video I want to talk about the Spanish, which goes knight f3, knight c6, and now bishop to b5. This is probably a more serious opening from white. This was, for the longest time, this is considered the absolute best chance for white to play for an advantage at the highest levels. It's definitely taken a hit to its reputation in the last 20 years, largely due to the variation I'm going to show you today for black. The move knight f6, this is the Berlin defense. This was really popularized in the year 2000 by Vladimir Kramnik when he used it to defeat Garry Kasparov. And it has not lost any popularity since. In fact, it's only gotten more popular. All of the top players have this in their repertoire. And it's a very, very principled move. You're just developing a piece. You're developing your knight, which there's a maxim in chess: knights before bishops. You're attacking the e4 pawn. You're getting closer to castling. It's a move that does a lot of good things. Now, if white were to defend this pawn with knight to c3 here, this would just transpose into the video I did in part 1, where now you could play knight to d4. This would transpose to a 4-knight Spanish, and I think after knight d4, black gets some interesting play. Instead, what I want to focus on are the more common moves. The most common in this position is to just castle. But before I go with that, I first want to mention the move d3, which is a very reasonable looking move, and it's a popular move too. Magnus has done a good job playing this. He won a nice game against Vichy in the 2014 World Championship with this. It's a good move, but I'm going to point out that it's actually making a very serious concession here, in that white is playing d3. White will not get the move pawn to d4 in one move. Now, what I mean by that is, let's talk like a mainline Spanish. We're going to go on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's instructive. The mainline Spanish, or what people used to play against the Spanish, and still do to some extent, was the move pawn to a6. White retreats his bishop. It's worth noting he can't actually win a pawn here. This is a well-known trick, but if white tries to remove the knight and then take on e5, there's a little mini tactic for black to win his pawn back. You can pause your videos, but I'm just going to continue because it's not really a tactics video. But black can play queen d4, forking the knight and the pawn. He'll win his pawn back with a nice bishop pair, and I already like black's position here. So white usually goes bishop a4. After knight f6, again, the most common move is just to castle and not really fear knight takes e4. We'll talk about that more in the main line of the Berlin, but usually black plays black actually could play knight takes e4 here, the open Spanish, or b5 first and then knight takes e4, but typically what they'll do is play bishop e7 just to sort of block the file a little bit. And now knight takes e4 is much more of a threat because rook e1 is not going to be as painful. So what white will do now is they will play rook e1 to defend the pawn. Again, trying to avoid playing d3. They're going to try for it in one move. So pawn to b5 now to break the pressure on this knight and the pressure on the e5 pawn. Bishop retreats and black plays d6. And now white will play c3. And the idea, again, is to try for d4 in one move. This pawn is supported. They will try to get d4 in successfully without wasting any time on d3. So if we go back to the Berlin, where after bishop b5, knight f6, I mean, again, d3 can't be called a bad move, but I think it's a concession that white is not going to really press for a super, big advantage out of the opening. Black can just play bishop c5 here and say, okay, I've got 3 pieces developed on great squares. I'm going to castle. It's very hard for white to really claim an advantage here. Again, I'm going to point out this trick: bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e5 is not working. Even though the e4 pawn is defended this time, once again, queen to d4 is very painful for white. In this case, it's actually even worse because black is threatening the knight on e5 and checkmate actually on f2. So white is actually just completely losing here. They're just going to lose material when we take on e5. Let's go back. Okay, so after knight f6, white's main move here is to just castle. Okay, and their argument is now, okay, so they're daring you to take their pawn. They're just developing pieces quickly and saying, okay, take the pawn, prove it to me. And their main idea now is to play the move pawn to d4. And the point is that it's probably not a good idea for black to take this pawn because rook e1 is going to be painful on this knight on the e-file. I will point out, a lot of times kids, when they see this position, when I'm teaching this defense, they'll ask me, well, can't white just play rook e1 right here? And they can, but this allows this knight to go backwards to d6, attacking this bishop. White usually plays knight takes e5 here. I don't really recommend taking this knight for white with the bishop because after something, say, like this, black just plays bishop e7. They'll castle soon, and I think this is, again, black has a bishop pair for nothing. I mean, I don't think the doubled pawns matter too much. So better from white is knight takes e5. Bishop e7 now, blocking the file. You really don't want to try this. This is not going to be fun for you. Check, and it's attacking your queen, so I don't recommend that. So after knight takes e5, bishop e7. White usually tries to save his bishop pair here by tucking the bishop now. Black will take this knight, dragging the rook out, and then castle. And, these types of positions where we've already traded e-pawns, black is rock solid. It's very hard for me to believe white can really have an advantage here. They can try. They can play d4 to grab more space. I think the biggest thing for black to know is that your knight on d6 is your worst placed piece in this line. So as such, I think that a very reasonable idea is just to move the knight and try to get in the move pawn to d5. If you can get that in, then later you can bring either the bishop or the knight back behind the pawn, and I think then your position is pretty much solid as a rock. I don't think white can do too much. And you can try to stop d5 with something like this, but I don't know. Let's just say bishop f6, kicking the rook back. Now you could play d5, I don't know, white could try to put more pressure on your pawn, but soon you can play c6 to back it up, bring your knight to d6, bring your bishop to f5. I think black is fine. Okay, so the most critical line then, what's considered the main line of the Berlin, is after knight takes e4, if white plays this move, pawn to d4. And the idea is pretty simple. They're pressuring your pawn on e5, which you're not really comfortable taking this because of what I mentioned before. Then the pin on the e-file is actually very strong. So once again, I think it's important to remember this motif in the Berlin. Your knight takes on e4, and then once there's pressure on the file in one form or another, it drops back to d6, picking up this tempo on the bishop. That's a critical difference if we were thinking back in the old main line of the Spanish with the moves a6 and bishop a4 included. If your knight were to drop back to d6 there, it's not gaining a tempo on the bishop. So I think this is pretty important. So here the knight is attacking the bishop. So what white usually does now is they resolve the tension by taking your knight. You take back with the d-pawn. And here white grabs this pawn on e5. Your knight is forced to move, so it moves to f5. And then they'll, of course, throw in this queen trade to, eliminate your right to castle and sort of uncoordinate your pieces a little bit. And we've reached kind of the critical position of the Berlin defense. Here... for the longest time, people thought this was just bad for black for some obvious reasons. The one kids always mention to me is that black can't castle. I actually think that's actually pretty far low on the list of problems for black. I think the biggest problem is white's superior pawn structure. Here, black's doubled pawns, I think, really do matter because he has them on the side where he has a pawn majority, which means if we were to just trade off all the pieces here, we would reach a king and pawn endgame where black is unable to make a pass pawn. Like if you think about these two c-pawns, they're going to get stopped by white's one c-pawn. So black is not really going to be able to make a pass pawn in that endgame, whereas white can. White has a very healthy pawn majority thanks to this, if we go back a few moves, this little exchange here where the pawn on d4 came to the king side really makes a difference because now white has a healthy pawn majority. If this pawn were still back on d4, this would just be totally solid pawn structure for black because white's not making any pass pawns in the endgame. Okay, so white has a better pawn structure and black's king is uncoordinated, or his rooks are uncoordinated because of his king. So why would anybody play this for black? Well, for the longest time, they didn't really. But then Kronrich realized, and players have since realized, that black's bishop pair is really, really strong. In particular, this unopposed light squared bishop is a monstrously good piece. It's hard for me to think of a chess opening as black where you get a piece that's as good as black's light squared bishop in the main line of the Berlin. A few reasons it's so good. White's pawn on e5 here. If this pawn were back on e4, it would interrupt your bishop a lot more. Like, for instance, if you were to try bishop f5, if the pawn were on e4, that's just not working. But with the pawn on e5, your bishop has a good diagonal if it comes to f5. Or if you try to push pawns, say, onto dark squares and bring the bishop to b7, that's another good diagonal. So you have two very reasonable choices for your bishop. Meanwhile, the pawn on e5 means white's bishop is going to be blocked. So I think it gives black a chance to have a very good piece and a very solid position. So there's a lot of weight plans for black here. One reason people find this line difficult to understand is there's so many different plans. But the main plan for white actually is really to try to push these pawns onto light squares so they harmonize better with this bishop and to try to get them rolling. As such, one of white's main moves here is the move pawn to h3. Somebody played this in a game against me, so I'm just going to follow this, that game. I liked to play, my favorite plan here is to play bishop e7, and the point is really to just go knight h4 and get the knight out of that. The knight's kind of a weird piece in this, so I would try to trade that knight, or just at least move it out of the way so I can get my bishop out. My opponent played rook to d1 check. I didn't really mind. I just bring my king back to e8. Now he played knight to c3, all reasonable looking moves, and then I went knight h4. And again, my idea is I'm happy to swap the knights and then just bring this bishop to this kind of glorious square on f5. He avoided the trade. He played knight to d4, which, I don't know, maybe it's going to end up wasting some time. And then this is another important idea. I actually played the move pawn to h5 here, and that's an important motif. It really makes it harder for white to just start rolling these pawns because you're just going to start taking, and then that'll open up your rook. The g4 pawn will be weak. So as such, he played actually king h2, which I don't think was too great. I think he wants to start getting stuff like g3 and f4 in and f5, and he wants this pawn to be defended. But it's just giving me too much of a chance to consolidate. Bishop to d7. He went here, I think, pawn to g3. I just brought my knight back. He went now b3, trying to get the bishop out this way. I took, and now this will be a good highlight of just how good a piece this is. I went bishop f5. It's really just bothering this pawn on c2. So he had to play rook to d2. That's the only way to defend it, which is clearly not a very comfortable move to make. And now rook to d8, and the point is I'm trying to dislodge his defender. He's not in time to take me. If he takes, let's say I take with the king, he actually can't defend this pawn anymore. Again, highlighting how powerful a piece this unopposed light squared bishop is. So he had to play the very ugly looking move rook to e2. And then I came up with this kind of fun little maneuver. I played actually king d7, just clearing space for my rooks to connect. And after he went knight to e4, and after I took my king, I'm basically consolidated. Now my king is essentially castled, and all my pieces are ready to go. He tried knight to g5 here, which wasn't working so well for him. I found rook to d1, which I thought was kind of nice, just pinning this bishop to the rook. And potentially his king could get in trouble, like if I can get a bishop on this diagonal somewhere, it could cause problems. He went knight takes f7, and after rook f8, he played e6. Here I actually blundered. I played bishop f6, attacking this rook, but I missed this nice little attack he had with bishop a3, and here I'm actually losing. I mishandled this position. The point is I can't, if I take his rook, he takes my rook on f8, and he remains up a pawn. But I should have just gone with my initial calculation, which was to play bishop takes e6 here. After he takes, I can take this. I'm hitting this pawn here, so he has to come back or defend it in some way. And now after bishop f6, he has to move his rook, and this bishop's in a really uncomfortable pin. And after something like this, I think he's in huge trouble. Like, say he takes. I'm threatening bishop a3, which is an absolutely massive threat, and it's not so easy for him to deal with that. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up because we're almost at time on this video. But yeah, so the Berlin defense. Main ideas are black is extremely solid, and you got to watch out for white's pawns. Try to trade off this knight with bishop e7, and your light square bishop is an excellent piece. All right, I will see you guys in the next video.